Welcome to the lecture entitled The Unificatory Account of Scientific Explanation. I'm Andrew Chapman. In this lecture, we'll discuss 8 topics. 1. How to investigate the nature of scientific explanation. 2. The deductive nomological model, the pragmatic account, and their problems. 3. The swinging pendulum concerning normativity in the philosophy of science. 4. The unificatory account of scientific explanation. 5. Explanatory reduction as the mechanism of unification. 6. Preserving the good and jettisoning the bad from previous accounts. 7. Kitcher, Causation, and Empiricism. And 8. The relation between Kitcher's unificatory account and Salmon's causal account. In investigating the nature of scientific explanation, it's important to notice that most people take science to offer a particular sort of explanation. There's good reason to think that one of the things that separates different explanatory disciplines, that is, disciplines that give explanations, from one another, is the sorts of explanations given. Thus, the sort of explanation given by an explanatory discipline can serve to demarcate that discipline from other explanatory disciplines. Even further, however, there's good reason to think, and most scientists certainly do think, that the explanations given by science within its particular domain, namely the domain of natural phenomena, are better than competing explanations given by non-scientific disciplines. Thus, science claims a sort of priority over explanations of natural phenomena, since science claims its explanations are the best ones available of natural phenomena. An investigation of scientific explanation is an inquiry into the nature or the essence of scientific explanation. In order to search for this nature or essence, we should start by analyzing the notion of scientific explanation. Such an analysis of the notion of scientific explanation will result in an explication of explanation. An explication is a completed analysis of a thing, and explications, as their name implies, make explicit the nature of that thing by providing the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as that thing. Thus, when searching for the nature or the essence of scientific explanation, we should attempt an explication of the notion of scientific explanation. This explication will result in the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as a scientific explanation. The classical account of scientific explanation that was propounded by Carl Hempel, as well as a number of logical positivists and logical empiricists, is known as the deductive nomological model of scientific explanation, or sometimes the covering law model of scientific explanation. According to Hempel, any scientific explanation must meet all of the criteria of the deductive nomological model, or else it isn't a real scientific explanation. That means that each of the criteria are necessary for something to count as scientific explanation. And anything that meets all of the criteria of the deductive nomological model is a scientific explanation. That means that together, all of the criteria are sufficient for something to be a scientific explanation. There are 4 criteria that are individually necessary, that means each one on its own is required, and jointly sufficient, that means together they are enough for something to be a scientific explanation. These 4 criteria are: 1. The explanation must be in or be able to be put into the form of a valid deductive argument in which the conclusion of the argument is the explanandum, the thing being explained, and the set of premises of the argument is the explanans, the thing doing the explaining. 2. The explanans must contain, that is, one of the premises of the argument must be, a natural law that is actually needed in the logical deduction from explanans to explanandum. 3. Each member of the explanans, that is, each of the premises of the argument, must be empirically testable. That doesn't mean provable beyond all possible doubt. It just means that there is empirical evidence that is relevant to the truth or falsity of each of the members of the explanans. And 4, each of the members of the explanans, that is, each of the premises of the argument, must be true. A competing account of scientific explanation is due to philosopher of science Bas van Fraassen and is known as the pragmatic account of scientific explanation. According to van Fraassen, a scientific explanation is a telling answer to a why question. When we ask, why did such and such occur, or why did the occurrence of such and such have so and so properties, what we're asking for, according to van Fraassen, is a scientific explanation. The answer to these why questions is itself a scientific explanation. Why questions, that is, demands for scientific explanation, are distinguished from one another by 3 features. That is, what makes a why question the particular why question that it is, and not some different why question, is 3 features of the question. These are known as the topic of concern, that is, the thing that's being talked about. The contrast class, this identifies what it is about the thing that's being talked about that needs explaining. And 3, the relevance relation. This is a relation that stands between the asker and potential answers that determines what will count as a good explanation for that particular asker. If you take some why question and vary even one of these 3 features, you end up with a different why question. And it's important to recognize that these are internal and essential components of the why question. Notice that by focusing as much as he does on the components of the why question rather than components of an explanation, an answer, Van Fraassen's primary concern is with the asker and with what's being asked in the process of demanding and providing scientific explanations. This switch from answer to question is a hallmark of the pragmatic account and is one of the central differences between the pragmatic account and competing accounts. Even though the DN model and the pragmatic account are plausible at first blush and seem to capture important things about the notion of scientific explanation, there are serious problems with each one of them. The DN model's 4 criteria for something to count as a scientific explanation, criteria that are supposed to be individually necessary and jointly sufficient for scientific explanation, are both too broad and too narrow. They're too broad in that they capture things that are not scientific explanations, thus they are not jointly sufficient for scientific explanation. They're too narrow in that there are some things that are scientific explanations that aren't captured by the criteria. Thus, they're not individually necessary for scientific explanation. The pragmatic account ends up making the criteria for a scientific explanation nearly entirely dependent on subjective contextual features, such that not only is it not clear that what the pragmatic account claims are scientific explanations are actually scientific and not just explanations in general, but even further, it seems as though anything and everything can count as an explanation according to the pragmatic account. What counts as an explanation doesn't even need to be words if the asker will accept it as an acceptable scientific explanation. If there are no formal restrictions at all on what counts as an explanation, then the importance and the specialness of explanations disappears, and the notion of explanation itself becomes entirely trivial. There is a historical tendency for the response to any extreme position to also be an extreme position, albeit on the opposite end of the ideological spectrum. Thus, we often see, for example, that toppled far-right dictators are replaced by a far-right government. This is exactly what's happened in the historical dialectic, the historical back and forth between the deductive nomological model and the pragmatic account. The DN model was far too objective, too abstract, too strict, and too structural. The pragmatic account responded to these problems by being too subjective, too concrete, too loose, and too contextual. When the metaphorical pendulum has swung too far in one theoretical direction, expect the response to be a swing too far in the opposite theoretical direction. One benefit of this historical tendency is that after the first two swings of the pendulum have been completed, we can look for a third solution that lies about in the middle of the two extremes. Scientific methodology is normative in that it prescribes steps to the scientist. It says, in order to do good science, you ought to follow these steps in this particular order. Thus, an investigation into scientific methodology, which is one of the main projects of the philosophy of science, is a normative investigation. A perennial problem for the philosophy of science has been how to do justice to actual scientific practice. And actual scientific practice has been, we need to admit, very successful. How do we do justice to this without simply turning into the merely descriptive history of science? Successful philosophers of science need to perform a delicate balancing act between the normative and abstract on the one hand, and the descriptive and concrete on the other. Philosophers of science who pay too much attention to the normative component of the philosophy of science end up producing accounts of scientific methodology that are too abstract and that don't do justice to actual scientific practice. Think here of Hempel's deductive nomological model. Philosophers of science who pay too much attention to actual scientific practice, though, end up producing accounts of scientific methodology that are merely descriptive and that are too concrete and not sufficiently normative. Think here of Van Frassen's pragmatic account. Once the pendulum had swung too far in one direction to the deductive nomological model and too far in the opposite direction to the pragmatic model, philosopher Philip Kitcher entered the scene. Kitcher is a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. He is generally an empiricist philosopher of science. Recently, he has been influenced quite a bit by the school of philosophy known as pragmatism. He's also a philosopher of biology and a philosopher of mathematics. During Kitcher's graduate school career at Princeton, he worked with both Carl Hempel and Thomas Kuhn, very famous philosophers of science. In order to determine the nature of scientific explanation, Kitcher turns to practicing scientists and the history of science in order to see what is common between things that have been called scientific explanations. However, Kitcher isn't concerned primarily with the explanation itself, but instead with what we are doing when we engage in the process of explanation. What's the goal of explanation, and how do we attempt to achieve this goal are Kitcher's central questions. So Kitcher is attempting this delicate balancing act between practicing science and the theory that should be applied to practicing science by starting out with practicing science, but noting that what practicing science is up to is a process, a practice, something that is engaged in. So Kitcher looks a little bit like von Frassen in how he's starting out his investigation, but the focus of his investigation is different from the focus of von Frassen's. According to Kitcher, we demand scientific explanations when something surprises us. That is, when something is unexpected or appears out of place. People aren't walking around asking for scientific explanations for things that they find totally commonplace, that they already understand. A successful scientific explanation shows us how what surprised us isn't entirely new, isn't unexpected, isn't out of place, but is instead either something we're entirely familiar with or is a manifestation of something that we're entirely familiar with. Kitcher takes these insights and develops what's known as the unificatory account of scientific explanation. According to Kitcher, in investigating the nature of scientific explanation, we should recognize that explanation is a process and not some abstract thing. Explanations are given in practice. They don't exist apart from the process of explaining, as, for example, the DN model claimed. The process of successful explanation is the process of showing that some apparently new thing is not new at all. Thus, explanation is the process of unifying phenomena, taking, for example, two phenomena and showing that they are really just one phenomenon, or that one of the phenomena is actually just a manifestation of the other. Specifically then, according to Kitcher, the process of scientific explanation is the process of uniting apparently disparate phenomena under the current scientific community's set of scientific beliefs. The ultimate explanatory goal is to reduce the number of brute explanatory elements in the current scientific community's set of beliefs to as close to one brute element as possible. This process, whereby disparate phenomena can be united, is explanatory reduction. There are a lot of technical terms there, and we'll look at all of them momentarily. It's important to recognize how pragmatic Kitcher's account actually is. It starts with what scientists are actually up to in explaining things, and what counts as a good explanation has to have something to do with the current scientific community's set of beliefs about how things work. Something that's entirely distinct from every single thing that the scientific community believes, understands, takes to be true about the world won't be able to count as a good scientific explanation, according to Kitcher. It just has nothing to do with what scientists are currently up to. So any change in science is incremental, and that's what we've seen throughout the history of science. Let's look at the notion of explanatory reduction, which is the mechanism whereby unification is accomplished. Scientific explanation is the process of unification. So it's not the case that unification results in explanation. To explain something just is to accomplish unification. Unification is accomplished via the process of explanatory reduction. This explanatory reduction should continue until the brute explanatory elements in the current scientific community's set of scientific beliefs is as close to one brute element as possible. So we have a description of scientific explanation as a process. We have a claim about how to accomplish that process via explanatory reduction, and we have a claim about how long we should continue engaging in that process until we get to as close to one brute element as possible. Explanatory reduction, sometimes called conceptual reduction, is a process of redescription or of translation. So for example, take two sets of sentences, call them S1 and S2, where S1 uses the concepts A, B, and C. These are just variables. It uses those concepts to talk about whatever those sentences talk about. And S2 uses the concepts X, Y, and Z to talk about whatever its sentences talk about. The S1 concepts can be explanatorily or conceptually reduced to the S2 concepts if and only if all of the sentences in S1 can be translated into or redescribed into sentences that no longer use the concepts A, B, and C and only use concepts X, Y, and Z without losing any of the meaning of S1. So think about how translation from one language to another works. Different words, different inscriptions are substituted for the original ones. The meaning isn't lost, but you have new things. Conceptual reduction is similar. Change out the concepts of one set of sentences for the concepts used by another set of sentences. If you can do that without losing any meaning, then you've successfully explanatorily or conceptually reduced. And Kitcher's unificatory account tells us to keep doing this until we get to as close to one brute element as possible. A brute explanatory element is something that can't be further explanatorily reduced to anything else. The goal of the unificatory account, and thus of scientific explanation, says Kitcher, is to have as few of these brute items as possible. That is, reduce and reduce until you can't reduce anymore. Think about this just on an intuitive level. If somebody says, here's a whole bunch of stuff, unify it as best as you can. If you keep doing something over and over again until you just end up with one thing, then you've unified really well. Now, you might end up with two things and you can't explanatorily reduce or unify one of them with the other. That's fine if that's where the unification stops. So keep going until you've got one or two or three or whatever number of things, and none of them can be explanatorily reduced to any of the others. Here's just an example of explanation via unification. This isn't a strictly scientific example, but it is a form of explanation that we could extrapolate and apply to other things that are scientific in nature. So imagine that I gave you a story that described a whole bunch of cats to you, and I said, this is a story that deals only with cats. The story says that something Tiger is a cat, and something Smokey is a cat, and something Max is a cat, and something Chloe is a cat, and something Shadow is a Felis catus. Well, what in the world is that? What's a Felis catus? Wasn't this supposed to be a story about cats? Well, you demand an explanation from me. Why is there this other thing, a Felis catus, in a story that's supposed to be about cats? So you're surprised. It seems like you found something out of place or that doesn't belong. In response to your demand for an explanation, I explained to you that a Felis catus isn't some new thing. It's also a cat. That's just the Latin name for a domestic cat. And by the way, Tiger, Smokey, Max, Chloe, and Shadow are some of the top names given to domestic cats. So if you want to name a cat something that a lot of other people have, you could pick one of those. In telling you that a Felis catus isn't some new thing, but is in fact just a cat, I've given you an explanation by unifying Felis catus with cat. And I've done this by explanatorily reducing the Felis catus concept to the cat concept. I've said there aren't two things here, there's just one. And once you recognize that the thing that you thought was out of place or new, the thing that surprised you, isn't actually surprising or out of place or new, then I've given you an explanation. That's all scientific explanation amounts to, says Kitcher. Of course, Kitcher's main goal in providing us with the unificatory account of scientific explanation is to say truly what a scientific explanation is. One of his subsidiary goals, though, in formulating the unificatory account is to preserve the good features of previous accounts, specifically the DN and the Pragmatic Accounts, while jettisoning their bad features. Both the DN model and the Pragmatic Account are early attempts at a unificatory account. The DN model unifies under natural laws, while the Pragmatic Account unifies under a contextually determined relevance relation. The DN model has a specific structure to it, the deductively valid argument form, and the adherence to structure is preserved in the unificatory account via the structure of explanatory reduction. And finally, the pragmatic account is concerned with what scientists are actually doing when they ask for and offer explanations. This pragmatic focus is preserved in the unificatory account by conceiving of explanation as a process that scientists actually engage in. However, the unificatory account jettisons the bad features of these previous accounts. The merely structural nature of the DN model and the trivial nature of the pragmatic account's explanations are gone from the Unificatory account. According to Kitcher, it will probably be the case that the brute explanatory element that ends up able to unify all other phenomena is causation. So causation is what we'll be working down to via our process of explanatory reduction, thinks Kitcher. Kitcher thinks that the universe is, at its fundamental level, structured via causation such that all events, all phenomena at all, are embedded in this causal structure. Causation has traditionally been taken to be an important component of scientific explanation. The thought has been, and this thought goes all the way back to Aristotle, that citing an event's cause is important or even sufficient for explaining that event. Causation is a connection between two events, one the cause, which is temporally first, and the other the effect, which is temporally second. However, Kitcher claims to be an empiricist, that is, a person who thinks that justification and knowledge are only possible via sensory evidence. But we can never see or smell or hear or taste or feel causation. We might be able to see, smell, hear, taste, or feel events, but causation isn't an event itself, it's the glue between events. Philosopher David Hume noted that empirically, what we call instances of causation are merely constant conjunctions of events. We never see causation. So isn't this a problem for an empiricist like Kitcher to say that causation is important to his explanatory picture? Well, while Kitcher does claim to be an empiricist, his empiricism is somewhat sophisticated and unorthodox. It's not as simple a version of empiricism as that propounded by the logical positivists. Kitcher's version of empiricism has what we might call a pragmatic element to it. According to Kitcher, whatever is required to get us from our empirical evidence to our unificatory goal is justified by the fact that it gets us to our unificatory goal. So Kitcher isn't giving us a theory that necessarily has non-empirical components to it. What he's saying is that my theory of explanation, the explication of explanation that I'm giving you, has only empirical elements to it. However, if in the process of giving actual explanations you need to use some non-empirical element, that's fine, so long as using it gets you to the unificatory goal. So consider this. We have a lot of empirical evidence that justifies us in believing that all sorts of events are occurring in the natural world all the time. Explanation, according to Kitcher, is the process of unification, and whatever thing, no matter what it is, would best unify these events in the natural world is permissible to add into our particular explanations precisely because it performs a unificatory function. It doesn't matter whether the element that unifies is empirical or not. Unification is the one and only goal. If causation ends up best unifying, then we should appeal to causation. If magical dragons end up best unifying, then we should appeal to magical dragons. Appeal to anything you please, so long as it gets us to that goal. Now, some might argue that Kitcher's empiricism isn't actually empiricism. Consider the claim that whatever is necessary for unification is thereby permissible, This is a claim that Kitcher is making. Well, that claim itself isn't derived from sensory experience. It isn't empirically verifiable or even testable. Why should we believe that whatever is necessary for unification is thereby permissible? Now, that claim does seem plausible, but seeming plausible is not an empirical criterion. It's a non-empirical one, a rationalistic criterion. But there isn't anything all that wrong with rationalism, the thesis that it's possible for there to be at least some non-empirical justification in knowledge. Almost all practicing philosophers are rationalists of some stripe, and perhaps unbeknownst to them, so are almost all practicing scientists. Of course, rationalists need to keep one another in check by providing good reasons for their non-empirical criteria and by debating these reasons with one another. Kitcher's non-empirical criterion that whatever is necessary for unification is thereby permissible is now something that philosophers of science should debate and see whether this is an acceptable criterion. According to Kitcher, scientific explanation just is the process of unification via explanatory reduction. Since Kitcher thinks that the thing that will best accomplish this unificatory goal is causation, he's happy to bring causation into actual explanations while leaving it out of the theory of explanation. However, this is not because causation is required for explanation, according to Kitcher, but because causation just so happens to aid in what is actually required for explanation, which is unification. Philosopher of science Wesley Salmon notes that in addition to unificatory accounts of explanation, a causal account of scientific explanation is also possible. This causal account maintains that scientific explanation is the process of citing the causes of phenomena. Salmon doesn't claim that either causation or unification produces a better explanation than the other, but that contextual factors determine which sort of explanation is appropriate in specific instances. Now, we might wonder, if unification and causation seem to be playing some important role in contemporary scientific explanation, whether it isn't possible to synthesize these two accounts and to produce one causal unificatory account of scientific explanation. That would be something above and beyond what either Kitcher or Salmon has tried to accomplish. In this lecture, we've looked at 8 topics. 1. How to investigate the nature of scientific explanation. 2. The DN model, the pragmatic account, and their problems. 3. The swinging pendulum concerning normativity in the philosophy of science. 4. The unificatory account of scientific explanation. 5. Explanatory reduction as the mechanism of unification. 6. Preserving the good and jettisoning the bad from previous accounts. 7. Kitcher, causation, and empiricism. And 8. The relation between Kitcher's unificatory account and Salmon's causal account. Thank you.